We're going to call the meeting back to order. We'll move on to item 6.4, which is the Fenelon Falls Second Crossing Environmental Assessment presentation. I'm going to turn it over to our staff, Corby Purdy, to introduce the consultants, and we'll go from there. Mr. Purdy, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mayor and members of Council. In 2019, staff retained Dillion Consulting to conduct an independent third-party Schedule B environmental assessment project for Fenelon Falls Area Second Crossing. The Dillion team has conducted 2 public meetings and 2 stakeholder meetings to obtain information from area residents. Following the presentation and discussion today, Dillion will finalize the EA project file and will include all correspondence received to date and any feedback from today. Staff will bring a report to a future council meeting formally requesting endorsement of the preferred solution. I'd like to introduce Rory, Marylise, and Ian from Dillion Consulting to lead the presentation.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, thanks, Corby. Good afternoon, Mayor and members of committee that are present, as well as staff and other members of the public. It's my pleasure to be in front of the City of Kawartha Lakes this afternoon in regards to the Second Crossing Environmental Assessment for Fenelon Falls. In preface of the presentation, which will be led by Marylise, I would simply like to say that an environmental assessment in Ontario is a very important exercise in terms of helping to make major decisions. And in this case, we certainly are faced with an important decision to be made. And I think because we follow the spirit and intent of what an environmental assessment is at its very core, there's a sense of confidence in regards to the recommendations that we're bringing forward. And with that as a simple preface, I'd like to turn it over to our environmental assessment lead, Marylise. And then as questions emerge later on, we have the benefit of our senior transportation and mobility expert, Ian Borsek, as well, to assist in answering questions. Marylise, may I turn it over to you?
Great. Thanks, Rory. Good afternoon, councillors and Mr. Mayor. So there's a presentation. I don't see it up right now. Great. Okay, I'm going to dive right in, recognizing that there's some high-level content that we need to get through in order to have the discussion, but there are some key details that I want to be able to spend some time on with all of you. So the presentation, there's 2 parts to it. We have our EA findings, and we also have in-town traffic improvements and summary of recommendations that is also based on the input we've heard from stakeholders and the public to date. Next slide, please. The purpose of the meeting today, of what we're presenting, is to give you the information on what we've completed so far, the input we've heard, our preliminary recommendations, and then to address any of your questions. As Corby pointed out, we will be subsequent to this preparing a final report to go to council, pending the outcome and recommendations that come from the committee today. Next slide, please. So really what we were tasked with is first and foremost to confirm the challenges around traffic through Fenelon Falls and to study those and I can get clarity on what those key issues are, as well as the opportunities for any sort of solution to address those issues. So the problems that we're seeing really relate to congestion and traffic delays, particularly during the summer periods from May until September. This year, October has also been quite busy. You know, with COVID, you've got a lot of people traveling through here. And the experience of the challenges sometimes is perceived as a bridge backup, that because there's only this one bridge here and because of its design, it's causing this backup. It's actually also related to the intersection that's just south of the bridge. So just south of the bridge is the intersection of Helen and Lindsay Street. The combination of both a smaller bridge as well as that intersection are what really result in the challenges that we're facing with traffic congestion. You can see in this aerial image that there's cars backed up all the way along Colburn Street in the southbound lanes, kind of going off the page, is a demonstration of the kinds of queuing that you can get through town. This affects the Main Street experience. It affects businesses. We've been told by local community members that it affects their decisions about whether or not they go downtown during these peak periods when there is traffic. And then in addition, there's a recognition both through our consultation and what we're seeing in our traffic studies of the challenges of transportation and land use in this scenario, that really at the intersection of Helen and Lindsay Street, you also have a Tim Hortons and a Sobeys, which are big generators of traffic and activity. The opportunities, though, if we're able to address some of these traffic issues, the opportunities speak volumes. You've got traffic delay can be addressed, but you also can improve the Main Street experience. You can improve connectivity potentially with some of the options we're looking at. You can support downtown revitalization, which is currently gone through a revitalization plan, is now being implemented. And ultimately, we can try to address some of the relationship challenges between the land use that's in play right now and the transportation network that exists. Next slide, please. So the core issues relate to two elements. It's traffic volume, but it's also traffic flow. So sometimes I think people think that it's just growth and lots of cars and therefore that's why it's congestion, but it's a combination also of the configuration and the design of intersections and streets and that network and how it connects. So together, those things are what we're trying to address in our alternatives. The third thing that's a component of these challenges is the route alternatives. So as you all know, given the geography and the topography here, there's not many alternatives. You need to cross this bridge in this specific region in order to get around the area north and south of the waterways. And so this becomes one of the key elements that we want to explore in the options for a solution. Next slide, please. The intersection issues that I was speaking to in terms of the challenges or the problems, this image points these out. This is really at the south end of the bridge. You've got a downtown corridor that's generally at capacity for that intersection of Helen and Lindsay. And this relates specifically to the southbound traffic in particular that's trying to get through the intersection, while you also have queuing to turn left into the Sobeys and the Tim Hortons site that's on the east side of Lindsay Street. In addition, there's a number of left turns being made from Helen, trying to turn north onto the bridge. And then from Lindsay Street, the northbound traffic that's actually turning left to head west on Helen Street. So there's a lot of turning movements that are happening here, and the queues get extensive and conflicts arise. Even, whether or not people are following the rules is also a layer on top of that we have to recognize when people are jumping lights. And then finally, there is an access control issue. It's quite a bit smaller than some of the other challenges, but that is just that because of the single design of a curb on the northwest corner, there's a gas station there, which means that people kind of turn into that site wherever they can and want to, and so it's less controlled, and that low curb causes a few challenges too, although not necessarily as significant. Next slide, please. So for us to address these issues, we had to undertake a number of studies. This is just a list to give you an idea of the work that we've done: transportation studies, environmental reviews, socioeconomic studies, cultural heritage and archaeology, and technical studies related to road design and bridge design, topography, property, utilities, those kinds of things. Next slide, please. So the options list that we came up with and we took out for public consultation was a do nothing option, which you always include in an EA study. So we have that on that list. And improve local traffic operations. So this is a smaller scale types of interventions working within the network that exists. Expanding the existing bridge. So can we look at solutions that actually address the existing bridge that's there and help manage the traffic challenges by doing that? Building a second in-town crossing. So looking within town, is there another location where a potential second bridge could go? And then the connections that actually are required for a second bridge. And then a bypass. Is there a bypass around town, and what would the value of that be, and how effective would that be, and where would it be? Next slide, please. So I'll start with our traffic study because I think it's important to set the base, to set the grounding of the recommendations that are being made. So there's quite a lot of work done around existing traffic issues. So we did two things. One is we did set up video cameras to actually look at live traffic in the area at the end of May last year. We also, though, so that was a period of a number of days where we looked at traffic over the whole course of 4 days. And then we also did an examination based on data collection. So we use something called streetlight data, which tracks the data of GPS systems, both on phones and in cars, and looks at the origin and destination of that traffic that crosses the bridge. So it's actually a great tool to be able to really hone in on of the traffic that is crossing this bridge. Where is it coming from? Where is it going? And can we extrapolate some key analysis from this data to give us a good understanding of what kind of solutions would serve the traffic that's actually using the bridge. And what we found is that most vehicle trips that use the bridge are originating in a relatively local area. And I think this was a bit surprising at first, that there is a kind of a perceived perspective that people are coming in from outside or they're just passing through, and that it's 905 or cottagers who just come through and they're not really staying local. And I think what we found is that there's quite a large proportion of traffic that is relatively local, and that's not surprising in the long run because there aren't a lot of alternatives. I mean, it's not as if people can go very far without hopping in their car in this geography. Next slide, please. So here's a visual that shows you a map of the different zones that we looked at within the data that we collected. And keeping in mind that what we did is I have gotten a couple questions on this. The data was for all summer. So we were able to gather the data from the whole summer period, June to September. And we looked at midweek periods, we looked at weekend peak periods, we looked at commercial vehicles, we looked at autos. So we were able to really break down and inform the decisions we're recommending today based on drawing from that. So the purple is the boundary of the city of Kawartha Lakes, and the star is the bridge. So when I said what we were able to identify people specifically crossing this bridge, that's the location of what we're talking about. And ultimately, the majority of trips, over 70% of the trips, are coming from within the city of Kawartha Lakes. Up to 20% of those trips are between Kawartha Lakes and the external areas. So that's still, that's a reasonable number. It's 20% of the traffic, and we want to make sure that that's understood. That we're not saying that there's no external movement to and from. We just want to understand it within the context of the other numbers. Between 35 and 39 or 40% of the trips travel from north to south or south to north. So it's a specific movement using the bridge to cross and travel through this area. And then 47 to 50% of the trips are actually between the areas that are south of the bridge. And so when I say south of the bridge, that's really the areas that are those zones that abut Sturgeon Lake. So next slide, please. I do want to point out, if there are questions about the data that we collected and the findings that we have, I do have additional supplementary materials at all if that comes up in the discussion, so that we can show you. So ultimately, what does this tell us? It tells us that given that there's a lot of local traffic, first of all, we need to address some of the traffic operation issues in town. If this is locally generated and that they're in destinations that are local, then we should be looking at that. So we want to make sure that's on the table. And number two, that there's some support for both in-town movement with traffic diversion. So approximately 20 to 30% of the traffic could be diverted around town. As I noted in the previous slide, 20% of the traffic is traveling north-south through the city of Kawartha Lakes, which means there's actually an opportunity for 20 to 30% of that traffic to be diverted. If you wanted to do a second bridge, you'd have 40 to 50% of the traffic could be diverted on a parallel second bridge in town. So there's our context. In terms of options, next slide, please. The traffic operation improvements. So I'm going to start at the small scale, so that local side. At the local level within the existing network, the traffic operation improvements that we looked at were very extensive. Ian can speak more to this if there's questions. As you'll see that note on the bottom, we looked at more than 25 different options, and they fell into categories of signal changes, access control, as I said, all the left turning that happens and the right turns into sites. So that's the land use relationship. Additional capacity. So when I speak to that, it's really storage lanes for all the queuing that happens when people are trying to turn and they don't make it through the light and the queue extends further back. Restricting movements. And then the potential to explore or relocate some land uses. We didn't get too far into that. It's more wanting to acknowledge that land use is inherent with the relationship of transportation, and to consider that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next few slides, it's a little challenging to describe because I can't point this out to you using a pointer or anything. So I'm going to try to say this as best I can. So the next few slides talk about ultimately the recommended in-town traffic improvement option we have. We in our public consultation, we showed a few more than what you're going to see now, but this is the one we landed on for recommendation. Ultimately, all of the arrows that you're seeing on the right-hand side, current condition, are all green. You can do all of these movements. You can drive straight through from Helen Street into the Sobeys and Tim Hortons site. You can, if you're on the bridge and you want to turn left into the Sobeys and Tim Hortons site, you can queue in the left turn lane and do that. If you are in the Sobeys and Tim Hortons site and you want to exit and go straight through the intersection onto Helen Street, or take a left and head south on Lindsay, you can do all of that. In addition to the fact that you can turn right from Lindsay Street into the Tim Hortons and out of it, and you can turn right to exit the Tim Hortons and Sobeys Street. What we are suggesting that of all of those permitted movements today, that we start limiting those movements. And ultimately, we start to reduce the amount of traffic that specifically is using this intersection only to both access the Sobeys, the Tim Hortons, the bridge, heading north-south cross through the town, get access to Colburn Street, etc. So you're seeing here that the bullets describe those changes in turning movements. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll see in the subsequent slides what then results. So first of all, if we eliminate the left turn from the bridge, so if you're headed southbound and you cross over the bridge, and we take off the left turn to be able to turn into Sobeys Tim Hortons, what does that mean? How do you get to the Sobeys and Tim Hortons? You go down to Elliott Street, and there would be a new intersection, a new light added at Elliott Street, and the left turn would be permitted there. So you can see in blue the movement from the bridge southbound to go into the Sobeys around the back of the building. There is already an access to the Tim Hortons on Elliott Street, so that's how you would get into the Tim Hortons from there, from that earlier access point that's closer to Lindsay Street. In addition, for people from Helen Street, instead of being able to drive straight through into the Sobeys and Tim Hortons, they would have to take a right at Lindsay and then a left onto Elliott. The traffic, ultimately what this would do, it would move the traffic around a bit and relieve that pressure for those turning movements, and allow actually for a little bit more green time for through traffic. So you can get more traffic through town, and that actually is one of the key outcomes of this solution. Next slide, please. Step 3 is that to exit. So what we're recommending is that you can exit the Sobeys and Tim Hortons site. It is a right in, right out. But if you wanted to go south, or if you wanted to go west, you would use Elliott Street. So again, if you were at the Tim Hortons, you could use the existing Elliott Street entrance and exit. But for Sobeys, you would go around the back, and that road is currently only a service access to the Sobeys and Tim Hortons. It's right of way. The width of the property is wide enough. It would require repaving. But other than that, it could accommodate the movements we are suggesting. Next slide, please. So combining all of this is what it looks like all together. At the intersection of Helen and Lindsay, there will now be 2 southbound through lanes, which you don't have currently, and that will get vehicles through the intersection with less green time than you actually require, and allows for more green time to be given to the other movements at that intersection. The southbound left turns are better accommodated at Elliott Street, and there's fewer conflicts. So when we're modeling this with the traffic modeling, we're able to see that the conflict is reduced, and they're able to get more vehicles through. It is really important that we talk about Elliott Street itself. This has implications for Elliott Street, and we want to acknowledge that and make sure that there's some discussion on that. I will get to that in the next slide. There's also potential, so this is the solution that we can put forward as part of this work within the public space right of way that's available. Additional improvements could be made by working with the Sobeys and then Tim Hortons. There's potential opportunity to acquire other sites on that property to allow for them to reorganize entrances and exits and circulation on their property. So there's some on-site improvements that could be made. Obviously, we can't make those recommendations for them, but it is something that they're aware of and that could be further explored. Next slide, please. So Elliott Street, as I said, getting to the key point of Elliott. So there have been a number of questions from the community about this, and I want to be clear that Elliott Street has already been planned for reconstruction. So there are current issues, and people have brought those forward to me as well. The condition of Elliott is not great, but most importantly is the Tim Hortons traffic. So this is outside of necessarily the peak traffic issues that are being faced even within our EA study. This is a case of Tim Hortons, you know, in the sense that it's not just here. This happens all over the place with very popular drive-through destinations. And so to address that, the city has been looking at, through another separate work, upgrades to Elliott Street to deal with the condition of Elliott itself, as well as potentially address some of the Tim Hortons access issues. Ultimately, what we're recommending is that you actually go a bit further than what's currently in the reconstruction plan for Elliott, and we revisit it because, as you can see here, within the property limits, so without needing to take property from anyone, you can add a left turn lane as a center lane on Elliott Street. And what we're showing here is just an example of that. This is just really preliminary. It's not wasn't part of our work to really draw up Elliott Street in itself, but that should be the next step if this was pushed forward. And that is the center lane. There is space to add a third lane, which would be a center lane. You could use it depending on the outcome of actually working through the design. You could either make it longer to accommodate left turns into the Tim Hortons, or you could split it as we're showing here, so you have left turns from Elliott onto Lindsay Street, or you could make the left turn from Elliott onto Lindsay a bit shorter because it's actually got less demand than the turn into Tim Hortons, so that through traffic on Elliott Street can get by, because the issues today is that through traffic cannot get by when there is a backup into the Tim Hortons. And it's, you know, we've heard about it backing all the way out onto Lindsay and down Lindsay Street, and there's some safety concerns about cars trying to swerve around to continue north. So the challenges there are, you know, they're beyond even just the CA in this study. This is something we recommend go forward regardless, because of the issues that are happening here with that with those movements. So that sums up what I've got here for the traffic improvements in town. So that's our recommendation, part one, for the work we've done. Next slide, please. So in addition to this, so that work on traffic improvements, it doesn't require EA. It can all be done within the Schedule A, Schedule A+ categories of an environmental assessment. The next items are all items that require larger EAs, and that's what I'm going to go through here, is what we've assessed and where we've landed on that. So one of them, as I said earlier, is bridge widening. I'll get right to it here. We don't recommend that bridge widening be considered as a solution to traffic. So we acknowledge there actually bridge rehab is required, and it's something that's on the books for Fenelon Falls, and that's an important thing. Within that, we also heard quite a lot from the community, and we agree that improving the pedestrian crossing that's part of the bridge is important, and that can happen. One of the key things is to move it to the east side of the bridge instead of its current location, and to make it better. Currently it floods and it's not wide enough for, you know, two mobility devices to pass each other, etc. So those kinds of things we do agree with, and they should happen. But expanding the bridge either to accommodate a larger queuing lane for southbound traffic to turn left into the Sobeys Tim Hortons, or to just expand it so that you could have two through lanes that would merge together. What we're seeing in our traffic results is that we're not getting the benefit because of what I had explained earlier, that the movements of turning at Helen and Lindsay, even if you increase the queue length of, or the space for vehicles to queue along the bridge, they would continue to queue, and eventually your queue would merge in with the through lane. And that continuation of queuing is because you just can't get enough vehicles through this intersection, turning left through this intersection with all the other competing demands that are happening. So ultimately, the bridge expansion for traffic improvement is not what we recommend. Next slide, please. The second bridge solution is the in-town bridge crossing. So there's been a lot of discussion about this, and I still have a number of conversations on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, with residents about opportunities for second in-town crossing. So as part of our study and the recommendations that we have here, preliminary items, is that ultimately, second in-town crossing has a lot of big wins in terms of traffic. The scale of the solution, in our professional opinion, does not match with the scale of the need at this point. So ultimately, we're looking at 2031 traffic, and we don't see a need to have double the capacity in the local network here for the amount of impacts that are incurred through a solution that would be a second bridge in town. That also includes the cost of a solution of this scale. So the topography is extremely complicated here. It likely requires a 3 to 4 span bridge. We have roads that either on one side, on the south side of the waterway, that are existing residential quiet communities with schools and long-term care facilities that would have to connect over and across to new roads on properties that don't exist, some of which do have some cultural heritage and natural heritage features that we need to be cognizant of. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means the challenges are big, the costs will be big, right? And the impacts to property are big. So at this time, we don't see the scale of the need matching a scale of solution this big. It does not mean that that wouldn't be possible in the future. And I'll get to recommendations in a couple slides that I want to speak to that on. Next slide, please. So the next one is the bypass. So as I said in the traffic study, we found that up to 20% of traffic was going through, which means that is the potential traffic to redirect onto a bypass. In addition, it's also truck traffic. So we see this bypass as also a potential haul route. And that was actually previously identified by the city as a haul route or a truck goods movement potential corridor or connection. This bypass would have fewer impacts to property. We'd be using the existing Highway 35 connection up to 3rd Concession, and then across 3rd Concession and a bridge over the Burnt River, continuing on 3rd Concession to connect in again with County Road 121. It may seem like a big detour, but actually time-wise, it's actually quite similar and comparable, because the slowdown that happens through town, even in this graphic, you can see that the length of these routes is actually quite similar. And when you have to slow down when you're going through town, that kind of outweighs the additional distance that you might be taking for a bypass. This will have some property impacts as well. There are cottages here, and it's within a floodplain. So I'll talk about that in terms of the key issues that have to be addressed. But ultimately, we think that the combination of traffic improvements in town with the Helen and Lindsay intersection and a bypass is the scale of relief that's really well suited for the current and future traffic conditions that are projected to 2031 as we've studied them and with the information that we have. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in terms of the bypass? So unfortunately, this isn't the end of study that's required. A bypass over the river does require a Schedule C EA. So the work that we have done to date has been up to and including the steps of a Phase 1 and Phase 2, which is a Schedule B EA, which means we looked at the big picture solutions, which are those buckets I've just outlined. Now that we have a preliminary recommendation, if it is supported by council, then Schedule C work would be required, and that includes doing design to address these key issues. So the key issues are obviously property impacts. You can see 8 to 10 properties here that we've highlighted as key properties. Some may not actually have the footprint of the bridge, but we do recognize that they would be very close to this structure, and you could have noise and spray and things like that that would have to be addressed. And so it may be that you take a few more properties to provide a buffer, but that needs to be worked out in detailed design, or in the Schedule C work. There's the natural environment conditions. This is a river, there's wildlife habitat, and there's natural green spaces, well-established woodlots and trees in this area. Noise and air quality, I already spoke to. That also applies along third concession. So we have to recognize that we would be increasing traffic on third concession. So we need to look at the condition of the road and if any repaving may be required, etc. Boating. So navigable water clearances. Don't want to get anyone too. This is not a navigable waterway in the sense of needing to accommodate larger boats, but there are minimums required here. And in addition, I really recommend that consultation with community members here on the types of boats that are actually here and what needs to pass here and how you actually determine ultimately the dimensions of a bridge crossing. And then the road connection. So you'll see on this image, obviously all of these homes and cottages that are along the Burnt River have access. And so how the bridge would connect in with those access points, whether they're full stops here or what kind of yield system you set up, needs to be explored. And then finally, the blue, which is the biggest, is the floodplain. And it is in a floodplain. I think most people in this area know that the Burnt River floods every year. It is a challenge to be addressed in the design. We have had initial conversations with ministries and Conservation Authority about this. We believe it can be addressed through additional work though, and the scale of what needs to be done has to be confirmed in that Schedule C work. Next slide, please. So high level cost comparison, just to summarize where we're at, is an in-town crossing, as I mentioned, would be the most expensive option. You have the most property acquisition as well as easements, and a bypass would be less expensive, would also have fewer construction challenges in terms of the clearance and approvals. And sorry, I should note here, with an in-town crossing, the Trent Severn Waterway is a National Historic site, which requires Parks Canada approval. We have also had conversations with them as well. There is an ability to streamline the process, but if you wanted to proceed, you'd have to work closely with them to understand what their requirements would be, and including the clearances and design of the bridge. Often that includes things like you can't put footings near the edges of the waterway, and what kind of sediment impacts you may have. So that kind of thing would have to be sorted out for an in-town crossing. The bypass does not have the same kind of federal oversight. And then traffic improvements, obviously they have the least impact. They're kind of the lower cost range for improvements. Next slide, please. So throughout the presentation, I've mentioned a number of things that we've heard from community members. I just want to go through this list, and on the next slide, I will talk about some of the key things that have come up from stakeholders that we've tried to address prior to this final presentation. As Corby mentioned, we've had public meetings. We've had 2 public meetings and 2 stakeholder meetings. We've heard a mix of support and concern with solutions. I think what's really important is to recognize there's no silver bullet here, that there's no perfect solution, and what we are trying to find through this process is the one that has the least impact with the greatest benefit. There's concerns with impacts and moving traffic around. One of the key things is to say that you're taking an issue in Fenelon Falls and moving it to the Burnt River. That's something that we've looked at. And ultimately, when you're looking at a geography of traffic flow like this, some of the traffic is generated by some of the people that are broader than Fenelon Falls in and of itself. So I think that's an important understanding to have, that it benefits everyone and it impacts a wide range. The concerns with changing Helen and Lindsay Street and that intersection, I'll get to that in the next slide, but we have heard about the concerns about the recommendations we've made about putting an intersection at Elliott and restricting movements at the intersection. Many people have talked about concerns with Tim Hortons. I think I've touched on this with you. The recommendations are within what we can do for what's in the public space and the private space. There probably are some solutions that they could do on site that could be explored. And then a desire to see the existing bridge improved. So that's what I spoke to earlier. People, we have heard that the rehab, people are interested in seeing the bridge rehab go forward, and in particular want to see improvements to the pedestrian crossing. So following some of the input that we did do additional traffic work, and we progressed some of the design considerations to understand what they may be for the bypass. Next slide, please. And ultimately, so some of the critical issues and how we are thinking about them. So particularly the turning movements and the restrictions at Helen and Lindsay Street, we recognize it's a big ask of people when you have a pattern and established movement, you're used to using the road and the network in this way, that we're introducing a change. And it won't necessarily be palatable right away, but you know, it's our opinion that people will adapt, and with the improvements will come actually some benefits that I think people are looking for, and that's part of why we're making this kind of recommendation. It does require the improvement to Elliott Street, as I laid out, and that work should progress, if possible, as soon as it can. One of the other things that people raised was economic benefits of the second in-town crossing. So very fair to point out that one thing that our work has not done is explored all of the potential economic outcomes of a second bridge in town. It's not actually really within the scope of our work to do that. It's also heavily influenced by a number of factors. You know, actually some of the earlier presentations are really timely, because the things that may affect the local businesses and the economy, traffic is one of those conditions, but it will also include jobs. It will include housing. It will include it will include the regional economy, the local economy, the current market. So there's many factors, and this is one of the areas that you know, if people wanted that further explored, there'd have to be more work done in that. And I think that it would require many layers. It's not just a traffic lens that needs to be applied. EMS. So there were a number of times where EMS was raised as concerns that people felt like with one bridge and one crossing, there's big risk for not, you know, if there's ever an accident on the bridge or a failure, that EMS and emergency response could not get through. So we took that back to the city, and ultimately, whether real or perceived, what we heard is that the providers have not experienced or thought this to be an issue. So we have to go from that, is from the people who are providing these services. They haven't identified that issue, and there has been study done in terms of master planning for this emergency response, and that's not one of the key issues that's been raised. So finally, the big one is move quickly with the design of the bypass. We also heard that. I think people are supportive of a bypass generally. Importantly, we haven't had as much input from actual Burnt River residents, so that would have to be factored into the next work in the Schedule C work, and to make sure that those residents are consulted and understand what this solution means. So the recommendations, this is the final slide here. I probably don't need to repeat this. I think it's probably pretty clear, but progress with the bypass as quickly as you can. It's our recommendation to implement the improvements, the traffic improvements that we show for Helen, Lindsay, and Elliott Street. We know that there are still some questions from residents on that. So if there's questions from council members today, we're happy to take those. That may not be totally clear yet in the decision. The future bridge rehabilitation should consider moving the pedestrian sidewalk to the east side of the bridge. Schedule C work for the bypass needs to address the key issues I highlighted in that one slide: the floodplain, the property impacts, noise, air quality, that kind of thing. Working with Tim Hortons on their drive-through, the drive-through configuration, the access. I mean, it's not something to do within the EA, but it is an opportunity to carry forward potentially as a recommendation. And continue to monitor growth in Fenelon Falls. So this is the piece I wanted to come back to. Ultimately, our recommendations don't eliminate the potential for a future second bridge in Fenelon Falls. I don't have a number. I did get asked, I wasn't able to respond. I did get asked by someone I believe is watching, what is the number of growth that is needed to support a second bridge? I don't have a number for you. I'm sure there could be work done on what is the threshold. Ultimately, we are seeing an at capacity scenario for 2031, which means if we can reduce that by 20% in a bypass and then improve traffic flow, that will allow for a reasonable level of operations that could continue for quite a long time. And so ultimately, the recommendation we do have is that the city consider mechanisms and tools through which to secure and protect land for a potential bridge. So what's important to consider in that is really the future proofing component, which means to think about where those connections could be and where that a second crossing could be, and to protect those corridors, get some easements, those kinds of things, so that big development doesn't go in and it's even more expensive to build and it's even more disruptive to build in the future. So to really think ahead to potential corridors and to preserve space might be an option for the city to explore going forward. And thank you. So that's the final. So we're happy to open it up for questions.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Mary Lise, you ran through that like you knew what you were talking about. Thank you. That's much appreciated. So let's get a motion to receive, and we'll see if there's any questions or any conversation that we want to have at this point. Motion to receive, Councillor Elmsley, and seconded by Councillor Vale. Councillor Elmsley had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. You had public meetings in, I think it was May and November of 2019, and then we had a stakeholders meeting in August of 2020, but we didn't have any follow-up to the public meetings, and I'm wondering if it's possible that we schedule another public meeting in order to close the loop with the folks who showed up in 2019 who may be looking for what your recommendations are. And so Mr. Mayor, I'm asking that staff arrange with Dillion to have a public meeting in Fenelon to close that loop.
So let's make that one of the recommendations when we get to the report, because they're looking for future direction from this council moving forward. So I think that's a good direction to give when we get to the report, if that's okay. Councillor Seymour Fagan, go ahead.
Thank you, through you. So we're looking at some different options, and one of the options is a bypass through Burnt River. You said that it would relieve 20% of the traffic. So that's 2 cars per every 10. I don't really think that's much of a relief. I don't know 100 cars sitting in traffic in Fenelon. They do in Bobcaygeon in the summer too, where it's busy with all the bridges. They can go around. They do both ways, but I just don't see 2 cars out of every 10 making a big difference. You know, you might sit in traffic for 15 minutes, so you're gonna go around and it's gonna relieve 2 cars. And I know that area very well, that's my ward, and that area floods badly. That's where all the flooding is. So, you know, I just have a concern, and also if you held the meetings in November and May, in 2019, that is a cottage area, so the people probably weren't even around. So I do think that another public meeting is in order. And it seems like Sobeys and Tim Hortons are the problem. I don't know who allowed them to build there, but that's the problem. That's what's holding everything up.
Well, that's a whole nother discussion, isn't it? I'm not sure if the consultant wants to tackle that one. I'm not sure why we're spending a whole lot of money improving a traffic flow into Tim Hortons when maybe the discussion should be had with Tim Hortons about how do you improve your business model to get people in your restaurant, but I don't think that's within their scope either. So is there any other, I have a couple of questions. So if I can, and maybe through you, Corby, and you can point me to the right person to talk to. So with your recommendations and, you know, the bypass, I think, I'm good with these recommendations. I mean, just from what I understand of Fenelon Falls, the sidewalk, the bypass, you know, working with Tim Hortons, sure. Where I'm struggling, and I have to be really honest with you, and I know it's the implementing the traffic improvements for Helen Street, Lindsay Street, and Elliott Street, and using Elliott Street for that access into Sobeys and Tim Hortons. And I know you've heard it, you know, from during your public and stakeholder consultations. Is this is this the best solution from a whole lot of bad solutions that are available? Because really you're limited. I mean, I'm not saying it's your bad idea. I'm just saying it seems like I've seen traffic backed up many, many times from Tim Hortons right out to Lindsay Street, and putting a left turn lane there. Yes, the traffic will be able to go around it, but traffic coming north and going left onto Lindsay Street, you're gonna stall. I mean, the number of times that there's traffic backed all the way to Lindsay Street and beyond, the times I've been by, it's more often than not. And I mean, you know, there's local people live there that probably know that better than I do, but I'm just wondering if are we looking at, is that a solution, or is that just really the best solution out of the lack of solutions that are available? Or is there an option to consider something bold and different that maybe, you know, we're just looking at tweaking something that we already have? I understand there's a cost implication and appreciate that. And I think what you're suggesting would help. I'm just wondering if are we missing, you know, a really bold solution, and I don't have any idea what that might be, short of, you know, moving Tim Hortons to another location. But again, that's probably a discussion for another day. But, you know, is there something that we're maybe haven't looked at, or is there something that we could go back and say, you know what, if we really want to fix this problem, not just for the next 10 years, but, you know, Fenelon Falls is busy, it's growing, and the traffic's going to improve. And what can, you know, I get the bridge, I get the bypass, I get the things that we can do, you know, and one day we're going to probably need another bridge in the Fenelon Falls area, but not right now. I think what you've suggested will really improve the traffic flow considerably, not just the bypass, but, you know, the actions you're taking in the town. But I'm really struggling with that intersection improvement at Lindsay and Helen and Elliott Street, and just wondering if we're, you know, are we really, that's the best of the option, or are we really just, we need to go something really bold if you really want to fix this problem? And I don't know if that's a loaded question, or, yeah, so I don't know who to address that to, Corby, but they've all got their hands up. Ian's got his hand up, so why don't we start with him? Go ahead.
Yeah, I could take that. I'll get started. So we looked at a whole variety of solutions. We started with just looking at you know, restricting one movement at one access, and then we started looking at the more bolder solutions as well, including like a roundabout or a multi-lane roundabout. What would actually be required to accommodate that traffic through, including all the accesses? And once we started going down that road, it was the footprint that would be required, ended up being a really big concern. And so that was kind of put aside. We looked at some other bigger picture alternatives, such as extending Elliott Street right through over to Helen Street as kind of like punching it, so it would no longer be a T intersection, recognizing that has been previously studied as well, and that did show some benefits. It did have other implications in terms of you know, implementation challenges, that it would take a little more time, cost to get that solution in place, and still didn't actually prove to provide a better operation than what we were recommending in the current analysis. So we did feel we looked at a whole variety of solutions, and the one that we're carrying forward was the best one that kind of came to the top.
Okay, thank you. Mary Lee, did you have
Mr.
something you
Mayor,
wanted to
if I
add? Yep.
may, yeah, if I may, through you, Mr. Mayor, I just to add to that, I think that, as I said earlier, there is no silver bullet, and I think you're right that it is a challenging situation that the communities found themselves in terms of how both the network and the land use has built out over time here. If you're looking or interested in the big picture, big bucket things, you know, I think one thing that's really important to consider is that although we talk a lot about all the traffic Tim Hortons that generates, and same with Sobeys, these are really important attractors to an area. And so there's also a lot gained by having these. There's a lot of people who come to pop by that Tim Hortons and then realize they need to pick something up, and they're here anyway, so why not grab it? And there's a number of people who like they come into this area to go to this to go to the Sobeys because of the scale of what they can get at that grocer. And so thinking about the relationship of land use and transportation, and then also the value of these kinds of enterprises is important. And in terms of the scale, it may be a potential relocation of one of the land uses, but that does need to be considered in the context of people wanting to be able to get access that's in close proximity to these things. So there are also boaters who use the Trent Severn waterway, and they want to walk to that Sobeys, and they get out of their boats and they come along and they walk to that Tim Hortons. And so there's a lot of considerations that make it very complicated. And I think you hit it on the head that to get really grand in solutions, even if you were to do an additional second crossing in town, put it near a grocer and a Tim Hortons, and it will be even more successful. And so that's the same with the bypass. And that needs to be considered in light of how people move and why they're moving through this area and how they're using the network.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Riley?
Thank you for your presentation. I know you recommended 2 solutions, and I'm just wondering if the bypass alone, we're just thinking of out loud, the bypass alone, and it reduced 20% of the congestion, that obviously doesn't suffice all the solutions, or isn't there a solution by itself that's going to solve? I know it's not going to solve it entirely, but taking 20% out of that intersection and leave the intersection kind of the way it is, was that one of the ones discussed?
Yeah, and I think that that's absolutely reasonable. It's just really more a function of timing, recognizing that a bypass would take longer, and the traffic improvements are more near-term solutions that we could implement to fix things right now in advance of any other potential crossing.
Okay. Maybe you didn't understand the question. Go ahead. Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean. Yeah. No, I think you did. Yeah. Any other questions, Councillor Ashmore?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor, to the consultants. Just a couple things on the roundabout. They're great roundabouts, but they do need a big footprint. They need lots of room, like you say. So they would be great, but I think that's pretty tight to have a roundabout there. But my second question is a bypass. Have you looked at what the effect is going to be on economically on a bypass? Because bypasses sometimes aren't the greatest things for villages and towns, because they do really hit them hard. I'll give you an example. This is going back a long time ago, but dating myself, but in the 1970s, little village of Dunsford between Lindsay and Bobcaygeon, the highway went right through the village, and then Highway 36 at one time was a provincial highway, and then now it's a city highway. But it almost killed the village. It's bouncing back. It survived, but I mean, it had a detrimental effect on that village for so many years because of that bypass. But have you looked at the economic impact of having a bypass? Like really looked at it? Because you want to be careful what you ask for, because if you do a bypass, you might do a lot of damage to the businesses inside that town.
I'm happy to answer that question on behalf of the team, through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. As Mayor Lee said in her presentation, we did a portion of our work did touch on socioeconomic, but there is like another whole thing that can be done in regards to an economic impact analysis, which we are suggesting get done as part of the Schedule C, which is the broader piece of work that needs to be done to advance ultimately towards the bypass. I hear exactly what you're saying, based on my own anecdotal experience working in various rural and cottage communities around Ontario. Is that it is very much unique to each community. In some cases, what we've found is that the bypass can hurt, and in other cases, the bypass provides necessary relief to help the downtown be more revitalized. And in the case of Fenelon Falls, what I'm just simply able to share with you anecdotally is some experience. And as I said, the further study through the Schedule C would hopefully offer some technical science behind it. But in a cottage or like rural community setting, what you have in during peak periods is an opportunity for those traveling through town to be able to say, you know what, I'm just going to stop and take advantage of the fact that I can just stop here and do something, whether it's go to a restaurant, shop at a store, get some groceries. In that way, congestion in a small downtown or main street is actually not a bad thing, because there's this weird thing that happens where it creates a dynamic for someone to actually want to stop and spend money in that jurisdiction. And based on what we're seeing is that that's not necessarily the phenomenon that drives the traffic through Fenelon Falls. Through the data that we were looking at, there's a lot of through traffic, and they're not stopping. They don't want to stop. They want to get from point A to point B. So if we're going to create a bypass, anecdotally, the feeling, again, hopefully backed up by further science, is that we're going to move the people that want to get from A to B to a portion of road where they can do that, and then open up the downtown for everyone that wants to go downtown, and make it a lot easier to get there and make the downtown hopefully a more vibrant, enjoyable place to be. And that's, again, some anecdotal experience based on my own years and things that I've been hearing from stakeholders through the course of this process.
Thank you. Any further questions? So I have one more. So what was the rationale from, I'm looking at your map of all the arrows, Helen Street again. What's the rationale for people coming up Helen and not allowing them to go straight over into Sobeys, or people coming out of Sobeys and not allowing them to go straight onto Helen Street? I get the no left turn. I get the no left turn coming south across the bridge into Sobeys. That makes sense to me. No left turn coming out of Sobeys makes sense to me. Having those two lanes coming south and allowing those two lanes to progress down Lindsay Street. But what's the rationale for not allowing that straight across both ways from Helen to Sobeys and Sobeys to Helen, vice versa? Because it doesn't seem like it would create a little bit easier traffic flow for in and out, and it wouldn't really congest too much. So can I leave that one with you?
Sure, I could. I'll take that. One of the big things is just there's a real constraint on the amount of green time that's available for the signal. So we looked at kind of adjusting the signal to see what we can do, but really in the end, there's so many competing signal phases that we can't find a little slot for an extra movement. So in terms of like the through movements, in order to accommodate a through movement out of the Sobeys Tim Hortons onto Helen Street, it would need its own green signal. Right now, we're recommending a right in, right out. That could be unsignalized. They don't actually need any green time. But providing that through movement means that all of a sudden now we need to take away green time from other movements in order to allow that to go. And once we did that, the other movements started being over capacity.
Actually, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Any further questions for the presenters? Go ahead, Councillor O'Reilly.
I heard the explanation, but I was the same as the mayor. Is there too great of a downside to continue that traffic going straight through Helen Street? I realize what you said, you give a good explanation, but I can agree with all the rest of the movements, and then I realize they all work together as well. But that's the only one that I see that, in my unprofessional opinion, that is more troubling than the rest of them.
So I'd say there is an ability potentially to accommodate the eastbound through movement, because that one may be able to be accommodated simultaneously with the eastbound left turn, which that we are maintaining. The challenge would be to put in an extra westbound through movement. That one would be a real, I don't think it would work within the signal.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Yeo.
Hi, and thanks for the presentation. I have a question on the bypass. And we just spent a lot of money on a new bridge on North Line Road, and it's not all that far from Somerville 3rd Concession. It's about, I don't know, about 1.5 kilometers down the road, and you go over the bridge, and there's a road that's already there, and it goes over to 121. So why would we buy a whole bunch of cottages and not just turn right, go over the bridge and take the road that's already there as the bypass. It would save a lot of money in land acquisition and bridge costs.
So maybe I can start with that one, and then Ian, if there's anything additional there. So through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. So we did look at that. Ultimately, it is quite a bit slower. It really it does add to the length of the trip, as well as the fact that we would like to introduce this. I don't want to have that truck component get lost in this conversation. The community has talked about this a lot, getting the trucks out of Fenelon Falls. The existing, the bridge that you're referring to, my understanding is that not necessarily well suited to additional truck traffic. I don't know the details on all of that myself, but I think that a key piece here is really the combination of wanting to create a route that would be used by truck movement, and that also would be direct enough to be comparable to the time to travel through town during these peak periods. Ian, I'm not sure if there's anything you wanted to add to that. Okay.
Ian's good. Okay. Councillor Riley?
Just most of the truck traffic is coming north of that center line bridge, the new bridge. So just to further to Councillor Yo's suggestion, I'm sure you did look at it, but a lot of the quarries that are coming out of Comiconkin to the north would be north of that center line bridge.
Is that a question?
The question was, did you explore where a lot of the quarry traffic was coming from?
Yes, so through you, Mr. Mayor, Ian, if you'd like to, but to the councillor, that the traffic study, the data that we were including was including that the truck data.
That means the origin of the truck traffic too, because I'm just thinking most of the quarries are in the north.
Yeah.
Yes, included that as well. That's what she's saying. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Councillor Richardson?
Thank you, and through you. So I might have missed it. What was, like, can you break it down? What kind of percentage of that traffic congestion is caused by Tim Hortons?
So that level of detail we weren't able to pick up. We don't have the actual in and out counts to the specific establishments on site. So it's hard for us to actually decipher what is actually the site generated traffic versus Tim Hortons versus Sobeys versus the other traffic. So we were primarily looking at intersection counts and the traffic that's being accommodated at intersections, signalized and unsignalized.
Okay, I'm kind of leaning the same way as our mayor at that time is, you know, maybe have that reach out with Tim Hortons. And I know I've read it in past where, you know, there's a smaller drive-through located a little further up the street to get rid of that congestion and make the other Tim Hortons as you're walking and sit in traffic only. It's just something I wanted to say out loud, so.
Which would be a discussion to have with the Tim Hortons to help solve some of the traffic solutions. Agree. Thank you. Any further questions for the presenters or for Corby? Okay, we have a motion to receive. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you very much. We'll go down to the report. 641 is the report. I'll just get a motion at this point that the report ENG 220023 Fenelon Falls Secondary Crossing EA presentation be received. So let's start with that. Get a motion to receive. Councillor Elmsley and Yo. Any discussion on that? Okay, call the question. All in favor? That's passed. You want to do a follow-up motion, Councillor Elmsley, regarding another public meeting?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That Dillion, that staff arranged with Dillion to hold another public meeting in Fenelon Falls to catch the folks from 2019 and update them on the recommendations.
Before the recommendations come forward to council.
Before the recommendations come
Okay,
forward to
second that?
council.
Yeah, I'll second it. I just wonder what the timing is.
Corby, when were you looking at having something back to council, do you know?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we were hoping to get something Q1 of 2021. However, if we want to hit all of the cottage people for a second PIC, then we could push that to make sure we can accommodate the cottage people.
So more of a back by Q2, try to catch the May into June type of thing.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yeah, I think that's probably best, as we'll the end of Q2 or early Q3.
You okay with that? Hold it up a little bit, but make sure we're talking to everybody? Okay, you're good with that? So let's put that in the thing that we'll target end of Q2 2021 to come back to council. Any further recommendations?
Well, we need the one following that, that it be brought forward to council at a future, and you're saying
Yeah,
second quarter.
all I'm trying to flush out right now is the public meeting is great. I don't think that's a problem. I think it's a great idea, but is there any other direction you want to give to Dylan or to Corby regarding these recommendations? Because this is the recommendations that are going to come back to council. They're going to have another public meeting, but are we, do you want any further study anywhere? Do you want another option looked at? Do you want some more information? Now's the time to put that forward to council. Councilor Yeo?
Yeah, I would like to add something in there about a bypass and putting cutoff lanes in off the highway and off the third line so as to eliminate stop signs and for the traffic and utilize the bridge and the road that's already there. So I don't know if they can put some more thought into that at all, if I can make that a motion, or if I'm just wasting time.
No, I don't think it's a waste of time. I think, how would we word that? That explore the option of the bypass, utilizing the existing bridge and road. I mean, you heard from the consultant, they've already looked at that, but what are you looking for? Some more data, some more just what's the upside to it as opposed to the downside?
Yeah, I'm looking at, like, I'm sure they looked at it, but I want to know if they look at not having any stop signs on the route and putting the stop signs actually on the back road. So it's just a continuous traffic right to the road. And I don't think it's going to be a whole lot longer. By the time you go down the third line and back up to 121, it's not a short distance. I think it's all relative to each other. So I'd like some more detail on it.
So explore the bypass option further, utilizing the existing bridge over the Burnt River and changing the stop sign configuration for a complete flow so they're not stopping at all the intersections. Go ahead.
Just to clarify, through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor, are we talking the recently constructed Mitchell's Bridge?
So just some more information on, I think what they're looking for is just some more information on that potential and what's, yes, you've mentioned there's a few downsides to it, but let's weigh those downsides against the downsides of a new bridge, taking people's cottages, the environmental impact and the cost. And if it's an extra 10 minutes for somebody using that bypass, let's weigh that against. So I think that's a good solution. Does that make sense? Do you have direction there? So you move that motion. Will you add that one?
Well, I have a question. If we're going to utilize the existing Mitchell Bridge, you're going to have to go through Fenelon Falls. Well, how else are you going to get there?
So coming from the north, the third concession down, over, and then east, right? It's just, we'll add that as a second recommendation before it comes back to council. Anything else? I think that's a good one, actually. Anything else, Councillor Riley?
Maybe, is there any environmental assessments that we think might be needed ahead of time? I realize we haven't picked the bypass option yet, but do we know if Mitchell Bridge can handle truck traffic? I guess that'd be a question that they can figure out too.
Well, ask the engineer, but I sure hope so. It's a new bridge, so.
Yeah.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. Yes, I believe it can, but we can confirm that.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
think as part of that motion, we can get some of those solutions. So are we comfortable with that and we'll go forward with that? Another meeting, look at the alternate route. And you made a great comment, not really the scope of their thing, but about having a conversation with Tim Hortons, you know, a separate little drive-through, which they've done, which I never really thought about. That's a good idea, so that might help too. So, okay, so we have the motion, and the last part of that this recommendation be brought forward to council at a future council meeting. All clear? Any other questions? Call the question, all in favor? That's passed. Thank you very much for your presentation today and for answering our questions. I know it's not an easy solution, and we recognize that. I think this gives you some direction to go forward, so we appreciate that, and we look forward to seeing your final recommendations when they come back to council. Thank you.